1971, the most decorated soldier in America goes on national television and drops a bomb that destroys his entire career. 90 combat medals, command of the legendary Tiger Force, a reputation as the finest combat officer the Pentagon ever produced. And he throws it all away with one devastating truth. But here is what nobody talks about. After the scandal, after the Pentagon demanded his resignation, after his own country turned its back on him, this American legend did not hide in shame. He did not retreat to some quiet corner of the United States to lick his wounds. He bought a one-way ticket to Australia, and he stayed for 10 years. 10 years. The greatest American warrior of his generation, living on the Gold Coast, building businesses, raising a family among Australians. Why? What did Colonel David Hackworth see in that country that he could not find in his own? The answer will shock you, because it has everything to do with what he witnessed in the jungles of Vietnam, with the Australian SAS soldiers who moved like ghosts, with methods so effective that the Pentagon classified the reports rather than admit the truth. Hackworth could criticize American generals for decades. He tore apart secretaries of defense, he condemned presidents, but about Australia, not one negative word, ever. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about who really won the jungle war in Vietnam, and why America's greatest soldier chose to live among the allies he considered superior. I, David Haskell Hackworth, entered this world on November 11th, 1930, in Los Angeles, California. The date itself seemed prophetic. November 11th, Armistice Day, the anniversary of the end of the First World War, a day sacred to soldiers everywhere. It was as if fate had marked this child for a military destiny from his very first breath. His childhood was anything but privileged. His father vanished early, leaving young David to navigate the harsh realities of Depression-era America. His mother struggled to provide, and the boy learned quickly that survival required toughness, adaptability, and an absolute refusal to quit. These lessons would serve him well in the jungles and rice paddies that awaited him decades later. At 15 years old, Hackworth did something that would be impossible today. He lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army. 15, a child by any reasonable standard. But this was 1945, the final year of the Second World War, and recruiters were not asking too many questions. The boy from Los Angeles became a soldier before he was old enough to drive a car. And he missed combat in that war, but Korea would give him everything he sought and more than he bargained for. When North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel in June of 1950, David Hackworth was a 20-year-old sergeant hungry for action. He got it in quantities that would have broken most men. The Korean peninsula became his crucible, the frozen mountains and bloody valleys where a young non-commissioned officer transformed into something approaching a legend. The statistics from Korea alone would have secured Hackworth's place in military history. He received a battlefield commission, rising from enlisted man to officer through sheer combat excellence. He earned his first Silver Star, then his second, then his third. The decorations accumulated like snowflakes in a blizzard, each one representing a moment when David Hackworth had done something extraordinary under fire. But Korea was merely the appetizer. Vietnam would be the main course. By the time the United States committed ground forces to South Vietnam in 1965, Hackworth had already served multiple tours as an advisor. He knew the country, he knew the enemy, and he knew with a certainty that bordered on prophetic vision that America was making catastrophic mistakes. The problems began at the very top and infected everything below. Washington demanded body counts, Pentagon planners loved firepower, generals measured success by the number of artillery rounds expended, and the tonnage of bombs dropped. The entire American war machine operated on a principle that Hackworth recognized as fundamentally flawed. They were trying to win a guerrilla war with conventional tactics. They were trying to defeat an enemy who moved like water by building dams of steel and high explosive, and the bodies kept piling up. American bodies, Vietnamese bodies, bodies of young men who deserved better leadership than they received. This was the reality that haunted Hackworth throughout his Vietnam service. In 1966, he took command of a unit that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons, Tiger Force. The name alone sent shivers through enemy ranks. This was a long-range reconnaissance patrol unit. aggressive and lethal, designed to take the fight directly to the Viet Cong on their own ground. Under Hackworth's command, Tiger Force achieved remarkable tactical successes. They penetrated areas that conventional units could not reach. They gathered intelligence that saved American lives. They killed enemy soldiers with an efficiency that impressed even the most demanding observers. But Tiger Force also embodied everything that was wrong with the American approach to Vietnam. The unit became infamous for alleged war crimes, for brutality that crossed lines no soldier should cross. Hackworth himself was never implicated in these atrocities, but he witnessed the corruption that the war inflicted on good men. He saw how the pressure for body counts, the dehumanization of the enemy, and the rotting leadership from above combined to produce horrors that stained the American military for generations. The war was destroying his army from the inside out, and Hackworth could not look away. By 1969, Colonel David Hackworth commanded the 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment. The unit had a reputation for mediocrity, for casualties, for all the problems that plagued American forces throughout Vietnam. Hackworth intended to change everything. He renamed it the Hardcore Battalion. He imposed discipline that bordered on savage. He drove out officers who could not meet his standards and promoted those who showed genuine combat instinct. Within months, the Hardcore Battalion became one of the most effective American units in the entire war, but even as he transformed his own command, Hackworth recognized a disturbing truth. His battalion, despite all his efforts, still could not match what he observed when he visited the Australian base at Nui Dat. This was the moment that changed everything. Nui Dat sat in Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australian area of operations. The 1st Australian Task Force had established this base in 1966, and from here they conducted operations that produced results American commanders could only dream of achieving. The first time Hackworth observed Australian methods, he experienced something close to professional shock. These soldiers operated in ways that seemed almost primitive compared to the American approach. No massive helicopter assaults, no walls of artillery fire, no overwhelming firepower designed to compensate for tactical deficiency. Instead, Hackworth watched 5-man patrols slip into the jungle and vanish completely. These men carried minimal equipment. They moved without sound. They could remain motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when they struck, the results were devastating. The Australians had learned their craft in Malaya. They had refined it in Borneo. And they had brought this accumulated wisdom to Vietnam, where it proved spectacularly effective against an enemy that consistently outmaneuvered American forces. But the methods that impressed Hackworth most deeply went far beyond simple patrol techniques. The Australians understood something that American planners refused to accept. They understood that jungle warfare required patience, not firepower. They understood that killing the enemy meant finding the enemy first, and finding the enemy meant becoming part of the jungle rather than trying to destroy it. Australian trackers could follow a trail that American soldiers would never notice. They could read broken twigs and disturbed leaves like pages in a book. Some of these men had learned from Aboriginal instructors, inheriting tracking skills developed over 40,000 years of Australian history. They hunted human beings with the same patient precision that their ancestors had applied to kangaroos and emus. The Viet Cong feared them, the villagers called them ghosts, and American officers watched in something approaching disbelief as tiny Australian patrols accomplished what entire American battalions could not. Hackworth was too honest to ignore what he witnessed. He was too professional to let pride blind him to reality. In his memoir About Face, The Odyssey of an American Warrior, Hackworth wrote words that still echo through military history. He declared that the Australians taught us a thing or two about counterinsurgency. He stated flatly that you will not find a better soldier in the jungle than an Australian soldier. He went even further, claiming that the Australians were the only white men who really know how to fight in the jungle. These were not casual compliments from a casual observer. These were professional assessments from the most decorated officer in the United States Army, a man who had seen more combat than almost any living American, a man whose standards were legendary for their severity. When David Hackworth said the Australians were the best, he meant it absolutely, and he decided to do something about it. The young lieutenants arriving at the hardcore battalion received an unusual welcome. Before they could take command of American platoons, before they could lead American soldiers into combat, they had to complete a requirement that existed nowhere else in the American military. They had to train with the Australians. Hackworth had negotiated this arrangement with the Australian command at Nui Dat. His fresh officers would spend several weeks embedded with Australian rifle companies, participating in actual patrols, learning skills that no American training program provided. These young Americans arrived confident in their education. They had graduated from Officer Candidate School or West Point. They had completed the Infantry Officer Basic Course. They believed they understood jungle warfare. The Australians educated them otherwise. For weeks, American lieutenants learned to move without sound. They learned to read the jungle floor for signs of enemy passage. They learned the patience required for ambush operations that might last days without contact. They learned that firepower was a last resort, not a first response. Most importantly, they learned humility. They learned that the mighty United States Army, with all its resources and technology, had much to learn from soldiers who arrived in Vietnam with equipment that looked almost primitive by comparison. These transformed officers returned to the hardcore battalion and applied their new knowledge. The results spoke for themselves. Hackworth's unit achieved kill ratios that matched or exceeded any American formation in Vietnam. His casualties dropped, his intelligence improved, his soldiers survived, but the American military establishment did not want to hear this message. The generals in Saigon and Washington had invested their careers in the strategy of overwhelming firepower. They had built their reputations on body counts and bombing tonnage. They could not accept that a small Australian force operating with a fraction of American resources had developed superior methods. The Pentagon classified reports that compared American and Australian effectiveness. Officers who praised Australian methods too loudly found their careers stalling. The institutional pride of the United States military demanded that American solutions remain supreme, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Hackworth watched this willful blindness with growing fury. By 1971, David Hackworth had reached his breaking point. The war had consumed hundreds of thousands of American and Vietnamese lives. The strategies he had criticized for years continued unchanged. The leadership he had condemned remained in place, and the bodies kept coming home in aluminum boxes. He made a decision that would end his military career and transform him into one of the most controversial figures in American military history. On June 27, 1971, Colonel David Hackworth appeared on the ABC television program Issues and Answers. Before a national audience, he did what no serving officer of his rank had ever done. He publicly condemned the Vietnam War as unwinnable. He attacked the military leadership that had produced disaster after disaster. He challenged the entire strategic approach that had guided American involvement from the beginning. The reaction was immediate and devastating. The Pentagon demanded his resignation. Fellow officers who had praised his combat record now denounced him as a traitor. His 90-plus decorations meant nothing to an establishment he had publicly humiliated. David Hackworth, the finest combat officer of his generation, became a pariah overnight. He could have stayed in America. He could have leveraged his fame into a comfortable civilian career, writing books and giving speeches about military reform. Many expected exactly this outcome. Instead, David Hackworth made a choice that shocked everyone who knew him. He bought a plane ticket to Australia, and he stayed for 10 years. Think about this for a moment. The most decorated soldier in the United States Army, a man who had spent his entire adult life in service to his country, chose to live among Australians rather than among his own people. He settled on the Gold Coast, that sun-drenched paradise of beaches and blue water. He started businesses. He built a family. He created an entirely new life on the other side of the planet. Why Australia? Why not Europe, where many American expatriates landed? Why not some tropical island where he could disappear completely? Why specifically Australia? The answer reveals everything about what David Hackworth truly valued. He chose to live among the soldiers he respected most. He chose to build his post-military life in the country that had produced the jungle warriors he considered superior to his own army. He chose Australia because Australia represented everything the American military had failed to become. For 10 years, Hackworth lived among Australians who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Veterans of the 1st Australian Task Force recognized the American colonel who had sent his officers to learn from them. They understood the compliment implicit in his presence. They welcomed him as one of their own. Hackworth could criticize the Pentagon for decades. He could write scathing assessments of American military leadership. He could condemn the strategies that had produced such catastrophic results in Vietnam. But about Australia, he never said a negative word, not one. This silence speaks louder than any praise he could have offered. David Hackworth, the most brutally honest critic in American military history, found nothing to criticize in Australian military culture. The man who had torn apart generals and secretaries of defense and presidents had only respect for the soldiers and institutions of his adopted country. For a man who built his reputation on speaking uncomfortable truths, this was the highest compliment possible. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment deserves special attention in this story because their methods represented the pinnacle of what Hackworth admired. The SASR had developed their jungle warfare doctrine through decades of experience in Southeast Asia. During the Malayan emergency of the 1950s, Australian soldiers had learned to fight communist insurgents in terrain that favored the guerrilla. They had refined these skills during confrontation with Indonesia in the early 60s. By the time they arrived in Vietnam, they possessed institutional knowledge that no amount of American money could purchase. Their patrol techniques bordered on the supernatural. 5-man teams would penetrate deep into enemy territory, moving so quietly that Viet Cong soldiers sometimes passed within arm's reach without detecting them. They could remain motionless for hours, controlling their breathing, ignoring insects and discomfort, waiting for the perfect moment to gather intelligence or spring an ambush. The kill ratios achieved by Australian SAS patrols defied belief. Pentagon analysts who examined the statistics initially assumed errors in reporting. No unit could achieve such results with so few casualties. The numbers had to be wrong, but the numbers were accurate and the explanation was simple. The Australians had developed methods that actually worked for jungle warfare. While American forces tried to adapt conventional tactics to an unconventional environment, the Australians built their entire approach around the reality of the jungle. They did not fight the terrain, they used it. American commanders responded to contact by calling in artillery and airstrikes. Australian commanders responded to contact by analyzing what the engagement revealed about enemy positions and movements. Americans sought to destroy the jungle that concealed their enemies. Australians learned to read that jungle like a map. The philosophical gulf between these approaches could not have been wider. Hackworth understood this gulf completely. He had lived on both sides of it. He had commanded American forces that relied on firepower and suffered accordingly. He had observed Australian forces that relied on fieldcraft and thrived as a result. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was honest enough to acknowledge it. His officers who trained with the Australians came back transformed. They returned with skills that saved American lives. They applied Australian methods within American units and achieved Australian results. The proof was undeniable, but the American military establishment chose denial anyway. The institutional resistance to Australian methods reveals much about organizational psychology and national pride. American generals had invested their entire careers in doctrines of overwhelming force. They had risen through ranks that rewarded firepower over finesse. They had built the most expensive military machine in human history around the principle that American technology could overcome any obstacle. To admit that a small Australian force had developed superior methods was to admit that billions of dollars and thousands of lives had been wasted on the wrong approach. Few leaders possessed the courage to make such an admission. The Pentagon leadership of the Vietnam era certainly did not, so the reports stayed classified, the comparisons remained unspoken in official circles, the lessons went unlearned, and David Hackworth watched from his Australian paradise, knowing exactly what his former comrades refused to accept. The years on the Gold Coast were not idle ones for Hackworth. He built successful businesses in property development and other ventures. He raised children who grew up as Australians, speaking with Australian accents, absorbing Australian values. He integrated into a society that valued the same qualities he had always admired in soldiers: directness, competence, and unpretentious courage. Australian veterans welcomed him into their community. Men who had served at Nui Dat, who had patrolled the jungles of Puoc Toi province, recognized Hackworth as a fellow professional who understood their methods and appreciated their accomplishments. He was not merely tolerated as an American expatriate, he was accepted as a warrior who had earned his place among them. This acceptance mattered enormously to a man who had spent his life in military communities. Hackworth needed to belong to a band of brothers. He needed the company of men who understood combat and its costs. He found that community in Australia among veterans whose methods he had praised and whose country he had chosen as his home. For 10 years, this arrangement satisfied David Hackworth completely, but America called him back eventually. The country he had fled still needed the truths he could tell. His experiences, his insights, and his credibility as the most decorated soldier of his generation gave him a platform that no one else possessed. In the early 1980s, Hackworth returned to the United States and launched a second career as a military correspondent and commentator. He wrote columns, he covered wars, he continued his crusade against military incompetence with the same ferocity he had displayed in that infamous 1971 television interview. But he never forgot Australia. He never stopped praising Australian military methods, and he never regretted those 10 years on the Gold Coast among the soldiers he considered the best jungle fighters in the world. The legacy of David Hackworth's Australian years extends far beyond one man's biography. His public praise for Australian methods forced some American military planners to reconsider their assumptions. His advocacy for small unit tactics, for patience over firepower, for fieldcraft over technology influenced a generation of officers who sought alternatives to the failed strategies of Vietnam. The Special Operations Revolution that transformed the American military in the decades following Vietnam owes something to voices like Hackworth's. The methods now employed by Army Rangers, Delta Force, and Navy SEALs bear striking resemblance to the Australian techniques that Hackworth championed. The emphasis on small teams, stealth, and precision reflects lessons that could have been learned decades earlier if institutional pride had not prevented it. Modern American special operators would recognize the tactics that impressed Hackworth at Nui Dat. They would understand why he sent his officers to train with Australians. They would appreciate the professional respect that led the most decorated American soldier to choose Australia as his refuge from a military establishment he could no longer serve. The story of David Hackworth and the Australian SAS is not merely historical curiosity. It is a parable about institutional blindness and individual courage. It demonstrates what happens when one honest man refuses to let pride prevent him from acknowledging excellence wherever he finds it. Hackworth could have maintained the fiction of American superiority. He could have protected his career by staying silent about Australian methods. He could have remained a comfortable insider, collecting promotions and honors while the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. Instead, he chose truth. He chose to praise soldiers from a smaller ally. He chose to send his officers to learn from foreigners. And when the system finally rejected him, he chose to live among the people he respected most. 10 years on the Gold Coast represented the highest compliment David Hackworth could pay to Australian military culture. His silence about Australian failures, so striking from a man who criticized everyone else, spoke volumes about what he found there. His integration into Australian veteran communities demonstrated respect that transcended mere words. When the most decorated American soldier of the Vietnam era chooses to build his life among Australians, the message is unmistakable. The methods that Hackworth observed at Nui Dat, the skills he watched Australian patrols demonstrate, the professionalism that permeated the 1st Australian Task Force represented something that his own army had failed to achieve. The Americans had the money, the Americans had the technology, the Americans had the bodies to throw at every problem, but the Australians had the knowledge, they had the patience, they had the jungle wisdom accumulated through decades of Southeast Asian experience, and one American colonel was honest enough to recognize which of these advantages actually mattered in the green hell of Vietnam. David Hackworth passed away on May 4th, 2005. He was 74 years old. His obituaries focused on his combat decorations, his controversial television appearance, his career as a military correspondent. Most mentioned Australia only in passing, if at all. But those who understood his story recognized the significance of those 10 years on the Gold Coast. They understood that Hackworth's Australian exile was not a retreat from military life, but an embrace of military excellence in its purest form. They understood that the most decorated American soldier had voted with his feet, choosing to live among the allies he considered superior. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment continues to operate today, still employing methods that would be recognizable to the men who served at Nui Dat. Their successors have fought in East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless classified operations around the world. They remain among the most respected special operations forces on Earth. And somewhere in the institutional memory of that regiment, the story of David Hackworth persists, the American colonel who recognized their excellence, the combat legend who sent his officers to learn from them, the soldier who chose Australia when his own country rejected him. For the men and women who wear the sandy beret of the Australian SAS, Hackworth's choice remains the ultimate professional compliment. The finest combat officer America ever produced looked at their methods and declared them superior. He backed that assessment with his career, his reputation, and finally, his life. You cannot purchase that kind of endorsement. You can only earn it. The Australians earned it in the jungles of Puak Tui province. They earned it through patience and professionalism and methods that seemed primitive but proved devastatingly effective. They earned it one silent patrol at a time, one perfect ambush at a time, one impossible kill ratio at a time. And David Hackworth, the most honest soldier of his generation, told the truth about what he witnessed. That truth cost him everything: his career, his country, his place in the military establishment he had served since childhood, but it gained him something far more valuable. It gained him 10 years among warriors he respected. It gained him a place in Australian military history. It gained him the knowledge that he had spoken truth when lies would have been easier. For David Hackworth, that trade was worth making. And for those who study military history, who seek to understand what really happened in Vietnam and why, his story provides a crucial lesson. The biggest budgets do not always produce the best results. The most advanced technology cannot substitute for proper technique. And sometimes, the soldiers from smaller nations know things that the soldiers from superpowers need to learn. The American military eventually absorbed some of these lessons. The special operations community that emerged from Vietnam's ashes incorporated many of the principles that Hackworth championed. Modern American elite forces operate with a sophistication and patience that their Vietnam-era predecessors often lacked. But this transformation took decades. It cost thousands of additional lives in conflicts where firepower first approaches failed as badly as they had in Vietnam. It required institutional humiliation before institutional learning could begin. If the Pentagon had listened to David Hackworth in 1969, if they had studied Australian methods instead of classifying reports about them, if they had valued effectiveness over pride, how many lives might have been saved? This question has no answer. History does not reveal its alternatives. We know only what happened, not what might have happened. But we know what David Hackworth believed. We know that he considered Australian methods superior. We know that he trained his officers accordingly. We know that he achieved results that validated his approach. And we know that when everything fell apart, when his own army rejected him and his own country seemed foreign, he found a home among the soldiers he respected most. 10 years on the Gold Coast. A decade among Australians, the longest statement David Hackworth ever made about military excellence. No words could have been clearer, no praise more eloquent, no endorsement more credible. America's most decorated soldier chose Australia, and in that choice, he told us everything we need to know about who really understood jungle warfare during the Vietnam era. The story ends there, but its implications continue. Every time an American special operator employs patience instead of firepower, every time a modern military planner emphasizes fieldcraft over technology, every time a commander sends his officers to learn from allies instead of assuming American superiority, the ghost of David Hackworth nods in approval. He tried to teach these lessons a half-century ago. He paid dearly for his honesty, but the lessons survived, carried forward by officers he trained and writings he left behind. And in Australia, among the veterans of Nui Dat and their successors, the memory of the American colonel who respected their methods remains a source of quiet pride. They earned that pride in the jungles of Vietnam. They earned it through excellence that even their most skeptical allies could not deny. They earned it one patrol at a time, one mission at a time, one impossible success at a time. David Hackworth saw, David Hackworth acknowledged, David Hackworth chose, and his choice speaks across the decades to everyone who wants to understand what really happened in the green nightmare of Vietnam and why a soldier with 90 decorations decided that Australia was the only place he wanted to be.